to another session of CACOR Live. I think it's the 240th. We started in April 2020, 48 times a year for all those years. So I'm very pleased to welcome our CACOR member, Ralph Torrie, to talk to us today. Ralph and I have quite a long history, and it goes back to Prime Minister Mulroney, who accepted a proposal from Howard Ferguson, the ADM of the Atmospheric Environment Service, in 1986, that Canada should host a special ad hoc international conference in Toronto. And that's where the issue of climate change really got on the environmental agenda. The following year, there was a World Energy Conference in Montreal, which got it onto the international energy agenda. So, but Canada's done not very well. We've spent the last several decades, and quite rightly so, in understanding just what is going on. We're at the time, perhaps past the time, when we really should be doing things, and Ralph is going to show us ways in which we could do things. So Ralph, pleasure to have you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome for your interest in this work and for this series in general. It's really outstanding, the presentations that I've seen over the last couple of years in this series. What I'm going to talk about today is it's really a preview of work that's been preoccupying me for the last year, and it's involved developing a scenario analysis of basically what an emergency response to climate change could look like in Canada if we ever decided to actually treat it as the emergency that we say it is. And I do want to, right now I'm working as the Director of Research at Corporate Knights, and Corporate Knights has received financial support for this research. And I'd just like to mention those foundations: the McConnell Foundation, the Trottier Foundation, the Chisholm-Thompson Family Foundation, and the Graham-Bock Foundation. And in general, I would say that the foundations in Canada have really done tremendous work in stepping up over the last 10 to 15 years in supporting work like this, that when you think about it, really ought to be financed and supported by the government. It never ceases to amaze me that here we are all these years after the Toronto conference in 1988, and we still have a paucity of quantitative strategies for how we could seriously curb the emissions of greenhouse gases that are destabilizing the climate. And that's what I've been trying to do with this scenario, is basically develop a picture by starting in the year 2050 in a Canada in which all of the vehicles have been electrified, including the trucks, in which all of the buildings are running on electricity through heat pumps, including the commercial and the residential buildings, and in which the electric power grids that provide the electricity for that transition are themselves running on emission-free renewable electricity. I'll jump right into the demand side analysis. I'm only going to show you very high-level pictures of this. This has been a very large quantitative exercise, and I think I have 300 graphs in the library of the work, and we will be publishing it over the weeks ahead. There'll be a final full report about a month from now, but there's a number of intermediate outputs that you'll start to see appearing starting next week. So what you're looking at here is the scenario I developed of electricity use in the residential sector in Canada from 2024 right through to the year 2050, broken down by end uses. The growth in appliances on the bottom that's just mainly growth. There is 0.8% per year population growth embedded in everything you'll see today. and 1.8% economic growth embedded in the scenario as well. But in general, it's interesting that even with that growth, one does not see strong growth in electricity consumption in the residential sector, even as we convert the existing gas-heated residential buildings over to electricity. This seems counterintuitive, but there are interesting reasons for it. One of them is that the heat pumps are so much more efficient than gas furnaces that when you convert a home to the heat pump, it needs much less energy, just measured in joules or kilowatt hours, than it does when it's heated with a gas furnace. Another one, and this varies by province, and the provincial variation is going to come up over and over again in the next little while as I describe this work, because Canada has many different energy systems, especially when you're addressing the question of electricity. And what started out as a study of national greenhouse gas emission reduction possibilities turned into 10 studies, because you can't avoid looking at each province individually. I should point out, by the way, that the space heat in this residential scenario of electricity use is broken into two parts in this graph. The solid red is the electricity use that the residential sector would use if the buildings were also retrofit to a fairly deep level, sort of 45 and 50% reductions in the thermal efficiency of the buildings. But if all you did was converted the buildings to heat pumps, then you would need to, and didn't do any efficiency upgrades, you would have to provide the electricity that you see in both the solid red and the patterned red slices of this graph. If you did the patterned area, in other words, represents the potential for using less electricity if we were to improve the efficiency of the housing stock. And I'll come back to that in a moment when we look at the big picture across several sectors. But the big takeaway for me here is the growth in residential electricity use, relatively modest, even though we're converting all of the housing to electric heat. And in fact, if you really pushed efficiency, there would be very little growth in total aggregate electricity consumption at all. And there would be a slight decline, actually, in total energy use for heating. Counterintuitive, but this is a result that has been shown over and over again when you really look at what could happen when you convert to heat pumps in Canada, given the starting point. This graph, again, for the residential sector, shows my scenario broken down into the electricity use that is that would be used in the houses that are already existing in 2024. Excuse me. And the light green represents growth in electricity consumption in the new housing between now and 2050. It simply illustrates a point that many of you will have heard in the discussion of energy futures and emission reduction scenarios, which is when it comes to the residential building sector in particular, most of the housing that will be standing in the year 2050 is already built, and the most energy inefficient and emissions intensive housing in 2050 is the housing which is built in the 20th century. So you see the existing housing dominating the electricity use after the conversion of all of the stock. I mentioned that there were quite significant differences from province to province. Here again, we're looking at the energy use. This in 4 provinces that three provinces plus Atlantic Canada. So when I use the term Atlantic Canada, I'm including Newfoundland and Labrador. When I don't, when I use the term Maritime Canada, I'm referring only to the trio of the maritime provinces, not counting Newfoundland and Labrador. The gray that you see in these charts represents fossil fuel energy use in the residential sector in each of these provinces, and the blue represents electricity use, again from 24 over to 2050. So in a province like Alberta, which is the top left graph, where Electricity is currently not used much for space heating. Most of the electricity use in Alberta today in the residential sector is for appliances and lighting. They tend not to use electricity uh, for heating. And so the growth of electricity consumption in the residential sector as the result of electrification is probably stronger and steeper in Alberta than in any of the other provinces. It's still relatively steep in Ontario, but in Quebec, where the starting point is 70% of the residential stock is being heated with baseboard heaters. So in this scenario, where all of those baseboard heated dwellings are converted to heat pumps, a conversion which results actually in freeing up electricity supply, we see, even with the growth in population, the total consumption of electricity for the residential sector in Quebec actually declining over time in this scenario. A similar phenomenon in Atlantic Canada, very, very little growth in the aggregate consumption of electricity in a scenario that converts to heat pumps. And I think the efficiency improvements are included in this particular outlook. If you took them out, you would see slightly higher growth. But bottom line, most of the residential emissions will be coming from existing houses. So this is a retrofit challenge. We've got to get them off gas. And, I'm assuming that the new housing would be emission free. And we know that's not the case. Every time we put up another house that's heated with fossil fuels, we're literally setting ourselves back in terms of in the long-term effort to decarbonize, because that just creates one more house that will have to be converted before 2050 if we're going to hit this target. Excuse me. I described this chart earlier, but this is the national picture when you add it all up. Modest growth in electricity in the residential sector, which is the blue part of this graph, and the decline to zero in fossil fuel consumption, which is the gray. And you can see the efficiency impact of the conversion to electricity. Those roughly 650 petajoules of electric energy in 2050 are providing the same amount of comfort and internal space heating, as well as all of the other applications in the residential sector, as was all of that combined electricity and fossil fuel in 2024, which was like 1,400 petajoules, of which it looks like about 800 was fossil fuel. So this is one of the real gifts, serendipitous phenomenon that one runs into in doing this kind of work, is that the conversion of fossil fuels to electricity almost always, with very few exceptions, results in very large reductions in the amount of energy required to deliver the underlying service. And the red line, of course, which is represented on the right-hand axis, represents the decline in greenhouse gas emissions from the houses. We'll talk about the emissions associated with the electricity use in a moment. But they're basically, the chimney would be an historical artifact by the time this scenario completely ran its course. We would not be burning fossil fuels in our homes. The commercial building sector, similar, but has some interesting differences. That's what this graph shows. The scenario that I have of commercial building electricity use, again, after complete conversion of all the gas heated buildings to electricity. There's some really fascinating differences that there's probably not enough time to go too deep into today, but growth in the floor area of commercial and institutional buildings in Canada plays a bigger role in this sector than growth in residential housing does. So you can see we don't have a doubling of electricity use in this scenario, but it does go from 150 terawatt hours to well over, somewhere around 275 terawatt hours. And the conversion to heat pumps is far and away accounts for most of that growth. That's the big red slice at the top of this layered graph of commercial building electricity use. Oops, sorry. The same story, but not quite so pronounced with respect to the contributions from existing buildings versus new buildings, occurs in the commercial sector, as we saw in the residential sector. Even in the commercial sector, with the growth I just mentioned, we see that the majority of electricity use in 2050 is occurring in buildings that were already standing today. And again, similar pattern to the one that I showed for the residential sector with the growth in electricity. This one is in petajoules, not terawatt hours, because it has both fuel and electricity on it. And I don't like to show fuel in terawatt hours. It tends to confuse people more than showing electricity and fuel together in petajoules. And so we have, again, a complete phasing out of fossil fuel consumption inside commercial and institutional buildings, with a corresponding growth in electricity use. Not as dramatic a reduction in total energy use, for the main reason being that commercial buildings are already quite electricity intensive. Even today, half of the energy use in a typical office building will be electric, even if it's heated with gas. So there's a much larger base that the growth is occurring from. Interestingly, this is an advantage in some ways, because in terms of limiting the aggregate growth in electricity consumption that results from commercial building conversions, because they're already 50% electric, just as a rule of thumb. If the other 50% is natural gas, so let's say this is just one building we're looking at, and all of this gray is natural gas for heating. When that gets converted to heat pump technology, it gets reduced to, let's say if it's 50 out of 100 units in the building, that 50 now becomes maybe 20 units of electricity instead of 50 units of gas, depending on the climate and where it's located and all of that. So now you have a completely electric building that used to be gas heated, and your total electricity consumption has only gone from 50 units to 70 units. If you then add on to that fairly modest, I would say in the neighborhood of 20% improvements in the efficiency of lighting and motors and HVAC equipment, which can be achieved in just about any building cost effectively, then that 50 goes down to 40. So now you have a building that was using 50 units of electricity and 50 units of natural gas. It's completely converted to natural gas, and its total consumption has only gone up from 50 to 60 units of electricity, and it's now fossil fuel free. That's a hypothetical case, but we're seeing that pattern in real buildings. We're even seeing instances. We did a big study of the federal government buildings in the Ottawa-Gatineau area a couple of years ago, and we had the Rocky Mountain Institute simulate dozens and dozens of the buildings in the federal government fleet in the Ottawa-Gatineau region. And when we were finished with the efficiency grades and the heat pump conversions that were part of the prescription for achieving zero carbon in that fleet, aggregate electricity use in the fleet was actually down, if memory serves me, by 18%. And that's after conversion to natural gas. So strongly counterintuitive. You have to actually see it to believe it, but you will be seeing that as the electrification and heat pump phenomenon moves forward. In transportation, by the way, there's a fairly large model underlying each one of these graphs. In this case, we had a stock and flow model of all of the cars and trucks of various sizes in Canada, which we move forward to 2050, converting them as we go, so that somewhere around the mid-30s, most of it, the thing is, you've got to get all of your sales of vehicles to zero emission by somewhere around the mid-2030s if you have any hope of hitting zero by 2050, because the cars are going to be on the road for 15 years and trucks, some of them even longer. In fact, we did implement in the last 5 years of the scenario, just so that we could get to zero, we did implement some accelerated retirement of fossil fuel trucks, because we just weren't going to hit our goal by 2050 if we waited for them to wear out. But it was fairly minimal. And again, that's all in the details that will be coming out over in the weeks ahead. But what you can see here, the dark green, those are the personal cars, all the SUVs and pickups, already on a fairly strong growth curve, notwithstanding the what I think will be temporary setbacks that we've seen in the last few months. The lighter shades represent uh, the trucks, light, medium, and heavy trucks, with actually the lightest color being the heaviest trucks, and the heavier shade of green being the lightest trucks. Go figure. But you can see that growth is somewhat delayed, but it's got to be going at quite a terrific pace by the mid 2030s if we are going to get the transition over to electric road transportation completed by 2050, which is what we would be trying to do in an emergency response scenario. And again, another one of these graphs where here you can see the very dramatic efficiency gain that comes from the conversion of road transportation from fossil fuel to electricity, starting from somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,800 petajoules of gasoline and diesel fuel today, split in Canada more or less evenly between cars and trucks. There's many more cars, of course, but the trucks are much more energy intensive. All of that gradually being phased out, accelerating in the 2030s, and the blue layers at the bottom show the electricity that it's going to take. With today's technology, no heroic assumptions here about improvements in electric vehicle efficiency, or for that matter, in truck vehicle efficiency. The heroic assumptions in these kinds of scenarios are not technological or even really fundamentally economic. They're more about can we get our act together and get organized and get focused enough on getting this done to solve the regulatory and institutional inertia problems and the lack of manpower in some cases that tend to keep us from achieving the rate of transition that would be necessary to get the country to zero emissions in these sectors by 2050. To date, in the Climate Dollars Project, we have yet to take a deep dive like we have into residential buildings, commercial buildings, and personal vehicles and commercial vehicles. We have yet to take a deep dive into heavy industry, general manufacturing, agriculture. And so because I wanted to proceed to take a look at the power sector, which I'm going to turn to in a minute, I put in placeholder assumptions for the electricity consumption that would characterize a transition off of fossil fuels in these sectors. I think I've been conservative. You can see we have a true doubling here pretty much of electricity use, except of course in the oil and gas sector itself. The power consumption of that sector goes down to a fraction of what it is today in a transition like this. But in the other sectors, manufacturing and agriculture and heavy industry, you're really seeing it going from 150 to over 300 terawatt hours a year. I think that will come down as we do a more detailed dive, but I wanted to be conservative because I would rather in the future say, now that we've taken a closer look at the transition of manufacturing to electricity and agriculture and heavy industry, we now think that in the future, I hope we'll be able to say that we overestimated the growth in electricity consumption that would occur in these sectors, but maybe not. Maybe we underestimated it. We'll find out. And we're going to dig into that as soon as we get this work out the door over the next few weeks. So this is what you end up with for Canada. As I pointed out earlier, there's a lot of provincial variation, but the overall picture is that electricity use measured as energy, now we'll come to the problem of peak in a moment, but in terms of electrical energy, the total amount of energy in a scenario in which we convert all of our buildings and all of our road transportation to electricity, and in which we have those default assumptions for agriculture and industry, goes from its current level of somewhere around 550 terawatt hours a year to just over 1,000 if we don't do the building retrofits, which again is that patterned red slice at the top of this graph. And so when you hear people say that the transition off fossil fuels, if electrification is going to drive it, requires a doubling of the grid, I don't disagree. I don't think it's a tripling though, not on an energy basis. Peak is another story, and we'll get to that in a moment. But in terms of the total amount of energy that we need to provide in the form of electricity in Canada in a scenario in which we make this transition, this historic transition away from combustion and steam engines and all the other old 18th and 19th century technologies to a more modern electrified economy. I think it means that our electricity, with the population and the economic growth baked in, I think it looks like roughly a doubling of energy, of electrical energy use in the country. And you can see the growth is in terms of energy. These two green slices, the dark green are the personal vehicles, the light green are the trucks and the commercial vehicles. In terms of contributions to growth in energy, that's the big one. It's not actually in some ways the most important one from a peak point of view, not at all. That's going to be the space heat. But because it's a brand new use of electricity, where we've never really used it to any extent in the past, it does, and it goes all the way to providing all of our cars and all of our trucks by 2050. It's a significant new entry, if you like, in the collection of end uses that will make up our total electricity use in the future. Here you can see, I'll just show a little bit of this. In Canada, that graph, by the way, that I was just showing, I'll just go back to it for a moment. That's a 74% increase in total electricity use as energy. It's not a doubling, but maybe by the time we're finished our analysis, it'll get up to a doubling. But right now it's sitting at about a 74% increase. Lots of variation at the provincial level, though. In Alberta and Ontario, we have the strongest growth, more than a doubling in both of those two provinces. But in Quebec, it's only 28% total growth, partly because of that electric resistance to heat pump phenomenon that I mentioned earlier, and partly just related to the structure of the Quebec economy. Ontario and Alberta tend to be the toughest ones. Now, let's move on to the implications in terms of peak. We've built models that model hour by hour from now to the year 2050. An electricity demand, the electricity demand. So we took all of those electricity demands that I've been discussing and applied to each one of them a load shape. In other words, we allocated the electricity use for each one of those end uses hour by hour through the year to see how this growth would affect the shape of electricity use. Now, the shape of electricity use that I'm talking about here is the big picture seasonal ups and downs, not the day to day or minute to minute or even the hour to hour variations, which I'll talk about in a moment, but the big winter to summer transitions, ups and downs that we see. And so the graph on the right hand side at the top is the situation today. On a national basis. Again, this varies a lot, and I'll show some of the individual province versions of this in a moment. But right now, the winter and this that purple hump in the middle, that's the air conditioning load. The red on either side of this is the space heating load. And all of the other loads, when you're just talking about week to week consumption, there's a data point for each of the 52 weeks of the year in this graph. So it's smoothing over the weekend to weekday variations. It's smoothing over, obviously, all of the much smaller time scale fluctuations which occur and which are, the daily preoccupation of power system operators. This is a graph that's more designed to bring out this big picture of seasonal peaks and valleys. The chart underneath the one in the upper right is the same picture, only with all of the growth that I've been talking about in demand, with the end use shapes allocated. And here you can see the challenge that gets presented. There's to me some really interesting things about this that are worth taking away. One is, notice the contribution of the electric vehicles. That's the dark green and the light green layers right around the middle of that graph at the bottom. And obviously they're missing in the top graph because we don't really have electric vehicles that would show up in a graph yet. They're too small. But they're pretty steady week to week. Now, they can be manipulated on a day-to-day basis, and I think they should be, and I'm going to talk about that. But in terms of the week-to-week load represented by cars and trucks, it doesn't change much between winter and summer and spring and fall. And so it presents growth. Yes, as I mentioned, it's the largest single contribution to overall energy growth in the system. But the capital investment that's required to provide all of this really depends on the peak consumption levels. And that's, as you can see, is being totally driven by the growth in space heating, as represented by the red and patterned red parts of this graph. And now you can see when some people, when they say, well, the grid needs to triple or needs to be 2 to 3 times bigger than it is today, if they're talking about annual peak capacity, seasonal peak capacity, I would agree. Right now, we're standing somewhere around 10 or 11,000 gigawatts. Is that gigawatts? I believe so. And yeah, this is gigawatt hours per week. So it's not a unit that you'd be that familiar with, but it's the pattern that's important here. It goes from 11,000 to looks like about 25, maybe 26 on a really cold week in January or February. So that's more than a doubling. So that is fair to say. At least I would agree with those who say that we're looking at a 2 to 3-fold increase in the seasonal peak, and every province, even the ones that are currently summer peaking, will be winter peaking when this transition is finished. That's even with the increased air conditioning that I've built into the scenario and the assumption of more cooling degree days and higher saturation rates of air conditioners, that's all in there at, I think, a fairly aggressive level. But still, it's the heat, not the air conditioning, that will drive the shape and the peak, seasonal peak, and therefore the capital requirements of the system we need to build, and we need to build it pretty quickly if we are going to support the transition of those end-use sectors to electricity. This is the pattern of consumption that demand will be presenting to the electricity supply sector, if you want to think of it that way. The provincial variations, they fascinate me. We can't spend a lot of time, obviously, I could give a talk on every province, and maybe I will later this spring. But right now, here, for example, is Ontario. And I said earlier, it's one of the two most challenging provinces, or the province that are facing the largest challenges for different reasons, and generally in making this transition of their grids to supply the electricity consumption pattern we're talking about, are Alberta and Ontario. In Ontario, you can see currently somewhat of a summer peaking province, and you see all this growth and very dramatic increase in the winter peak consumption of electricity associated with the conversion of the residential and commercial buildings to electric heat via heat pumps. So this is what we're facing if we're going to do this, and however you're going to provide this, you're going to have to do it in a way that can get over that hump, which starts around the middle of December and tends to start tapering off at the end of February. In those provinces, in most provinces, it's less pronounced in some than in others. Here's the same set of charts for Alberta. As I said earlier, very little use of electricity for space heat in Alberta right now, but boom, as you can see in the bottom right chart, if they were to make the transition to electric heat pump heated commercial and residential buildings, then it's just going to you might see a quadrupling of the amount of electricity that would need to be provided in January and February. And you can see the contribution that greater building energy, residential building energy efficiency could make to alleviating that challenge. That's the patterned red part of those peaks. It's worth $100 billion nationally if we can get that in terms of the savings of what we would otherwise have to invest in providing that peak capacity. Here's another interesting thing. Look at that gray bar at the bottom. Now, it's pronounced in Alberta. I've probably been too conservative in my assumptions about other types of electricity intensive heavy industry replacing what will inevitably be a decline in the fossil fuel production industry that would go along with this scenario. But if you look at, excuse me, if you look at all of the energy use that makes up that January peak by just casting your eye down, starting at the 4,000 gigawatt hour per week level, where you see the space heat peak, and going down through the space heat, through the vehicles, you've got this great big contribution from industrial electricity use, that gray bar. So it's not peaky, but it's on the peak. And I think that we may see in the future, as we move towards this grid, which is very different from a historical grid, I think we may start to see seasonal demand management, if you want to call it that. I like the term industrial hibernation because I think it's really a form of biomimicry where some of this gray electricity use that currently occurs in January and February, and then again, maybe even in midsummer, excuse me, would migrate into the valley, maybe to save money, perhaps through annual shutdowns with more intensified production during the months of the year when the renewable electricity is more readily available. And it's interesting, this argument came up years ago at the Porter Royal Commission in the late 1970s when Darcy McHugh and Premier Davis got quite worried about the future of electric power supply and demand in Ontario and called a Royal Commission to look into it. And they were seriously considering at the time, or at least some people were seriously putting forward the idea that we would have to start moving industrial production to the nighttime in order to save daytime electricity. And this was something that was characterized as a form of social engineering, which I don't disagree with. But then there's another almost completely reverse perspective that one can take on that, with industrial age itself that has social engineered us into thinking that we have to keep our industrial production going 24/7, 365 days a year, come hell or high water. And that's actually not the natural way of things. And so we might see a post-industrial modern society in which electricity intensive productive activity takes place to a greater extent during the times of the year when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing and the demand for space heat is lower, as opposed to having it just spread out over time. Sorry, I belabored that point. It's really a footnote. I don't even know if I'm going to put it forward in the final report because I don't really want to draw all the flack that it probably will as being a social engineering proposal, but it could actually be regarded as a defense against 100 years of social engineering. In any event, same chart for the province of Quebec, which, as you know, has developed a whole industrial strategy around successfully attracting to the province electricity intensive industrial production, including aluminum, for example. And so you see that large contribution even today from industrial electricity use. You see the large contribution already in Quebec from space heat because of the very widespread use of electric resistance heating in the province for heating. And so the transition for them, both in terms of energy and peak, is not so great because they already have an electricity demand shape, if you like, that looks like the one everyone else is going to have by the time this is finished, where you've got the two big red mountains with the purple foothill in the middle, if you like. They're already there. In fact, if they really leaned into energy efficiency, they could minimize even the peak demand growth in Quebec to quite a small level, uh, thanks again to the conversion of resistance heating to heat pumps having such a big impact in that province. Uh, BC is an interesting case because it's got a mild climate, but nevertheless, they too will face the winter peak issue as they convert their buildings to electricity. Now, there's a bit of a break at this point. I'm going to start addressing the supply of electricity. I don't know if I should just carry on. That's what I'm inclined to do, but if you'd like, I could pause at this point in case there's especially any questions of clarification regarding this demand side of the scenario analysis that I've been describing.
Ralph, I suggest we carry on. We're used to having all questions at the end.
Very well. So the next part of this exercise was to come up with an electricity supply that would meet both the level and the pattern that I've been describing of what the future demand or consumption levels of electricity would look like in a decarbonized Canada. And I did not use an optimization approach. I don't actually believe that this is an equilibrium system that lends itself to optimization. I also think that when you're talking about this kind of long-term exercise, the optimization algorithms tend to leave out possibilities, which can be quite important with a more normative approach. So I really sat down and I looked at the supply of hydro that we have. I looked at what are my emission-free options. I've got hydro, which has very limited prospects for growth. Notwithstanding the recent deal between Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador, which is significant. I looked at nuclear, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Here you can see this is my base nuclear scenario. I'll describe that in a moment. But the red is nuclear. The yellow is solar. This chart on the right represents the pattern of the electricity supply that I came up with that would meet that annual, that national aggregate demand for electricity in the year 2050. So you're looking, it goes from, the chart on the right goes from January to December, and you have nuclear, hydro, solar, and wind are the four contributors that you see over and over again in the different provincial variations of this. The black line simply represents, if you go back and look at the total consumption of electricity in Canada, you see, you can trace this line in the bottom right graph, and you look at the shape of that. That's the demand that this black line is showing. This does not, by the way, mean that half of the wind energy is not being used. It's more complicated than that. All of these sources are being used to provide the electricity from hour to hour in the year 2050 in this scenario. But it is true that you will have more renewable electricity capacity available than you will be using at any given time. That's nature of the renewable based intermittency of these new sources, is that the kilowatts of capacity that you need to build is larger than the than you might need in any particular hour. So I built this up province by province. What you're looking at here for Canada is actually just a summation. You can't do this kind of exercise for Canada from the top down. The grids are too different from each other. The starting points are too different. So what you're really looking at here, as I mentioned, is what the bird's eye view of the electricity supply in Canada could look like. So on the left-hand side is the overall growth in gigawatt hours per year of the different supply sources. And in this scenario, You can see the nuclear actually is at a pretty small level by the year 2050, because in my reference scenario, it includes all of the committed rebuilds, but that's it. Well, it also includes the Darlington, I call it the Darlington prototype, the 300 megawatt prototype. I don't like to call it an SMR because it's not small and it's not modular. So I'm resisting the use of that term, but you know, that's the reactor I'm talking about. I call it the 300 megawatt prototype that they're currently starting to build at the Darlington site. That's in, as are all the rebuilds which have been are committed. The spending has started, and they're sort of beyond the point of no return, if you like. So there's a lot of wind, and this is the case right across the country, British Columbia even. They're okay right now, but with the growth that's coming in population and electricity use, they'll have to lean into wind in order to maintain a renewable based grid that can supply that pattern of consumption that I was describing earlier. In Ontario, this is a variation, variation A. Okay, so this one includes all 4 of the 300 megawatt units at Darlington, all of the planned nuclear rebuilds, not just the ones that are beyond the point of no return. So it includes Pickering B, which was not in the previous graph, and Bruce is a mixed bag. The Darlington rebuilds are in all of the scenarios because they're a done deal. And this one also includes Bruce C, which I assume would be a 4 times 1200 megawatt addition to the Bruce nuclear plant. And with all of that nuclear, and I use reference case forecasting, by the way, which for those of you who are not familiar with the term, means that you base the forecasting of performance and cost of technologies, including nuclear and all the others, on actual historical performance, not on wishful thinking. So when it comes, for example, to the nuclear rebuilds, we've never had a rebuilt reactor in this country that's run for more than, I think we're up to 22 years on the ones that have been rebuilt the longest ago. So I don't think that it's prudent to assume that you can rebuild a reactor and count on it to operate for 30 or 40 years, or in the case of new reactors, for 60 years. So I've used a 22-year lifetime for the rebuilds, which means that very few of them would still be generating power in 2050 unless they went through yet another cycle of capital investment, or unless it turns out that they do in fact successfully work for a longer period of time than any rebuild has ever worked before, which is the working assumption of the power system planners in Ontario, which I think is not a prudent assumption. But in any event, this is the Ontario. Even with all of that nuclear, you need much, much more wind. And the approach that I took to this was to try and provide province by province the amount of electricity required from renewable emission-free sources without resorting to interprovincial trade. I'll come back to that question in a moment as I wrap up on some of the things that could make this easier and cheaper than it might otherwise be. But if Ontario were trying to achieve an emission-free electric grid to support a complete decarbonization of buildings and transportation as described earlier, there is no amount of nuclear that you could possibly build that would obviate the need for a massive build out of wind power. This is the reference case I mentioned earlier, where the existing rebuilds gradually wind down as you approach 2050. I'll come back to the nuclear thing in a moment. It's quite interesting. Alberta, one of the beautiful serendipitous coincidences about both Alberta and Saskatchewan is, in spite of those challenges that they face because they have not traditionally used electricity for space heat, and because they're in bloody cold climates, the wind pattern in those provinces tends to mimic the annual variation in electricity consumption patterns. So that's a bit of a boost for them. And that really helps with the prospects for a transition there. But it's a heavy lift in Alberta, no question about it. I want to just now talk about a few issues that came up as a result of this work. I end up with an electric grid. Well, for those of you who are wondering, first of all, the total capital investments over the next 25 years in the buildings, in the electric vehicles, and in my reference case for the power grid comes to somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 trillion, somewhat less than 2 trillion. It's right in line with what the Royal Bank published a couple of years ago, which I published in 2020, which the federal government said in its budget a couple of years ago. It looked to them like it would be about 125 to 140 billion per year for the next 20 years. I think that's a bit high. Now, I used to think it was that high. I now think it's probably south of 100 billion a year. And the what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought. The so the capital investment outlook is in that range. The part that relates to this utility stuff, in other words, the capital needed to build the wind and the solar, maybe the nuclear, depending on where you go with that, in Ontario at least, all of the associated transmission and distribution build out that goes along with that. That looks to me, in my reference case, to be in the range of $800 billion over the next 25 years. And one thing to keep in mind when you're hearing people like me go on about the cost of decarbonization, or when you're reading about it, is that there is a little bit of people talking past each other on this. Many of the estimates on the cost of decarbonization, including the one I'm doing, are basically just adding up how much we would have to spend on things, the electric vehicle premium, the electric vehicle charging infrastructure, the cost of the windmills and the wind turbines and the solar panels, the cost of the transmission and distribution, the cost of the heat pumps, the incremental costs of the heat pumps as compared with the gas furnaces that they would replace, and so on. Many of those cost estimates, they come out to very big numbers, and that's that number somewhere in the 1.8 trillion dollars that I mentioned a moment ago, in that range. That's not new spending primarily, and that's where the disconnect happens. The Economist, for example, published a really fascinating editorial a couple of months ago saying the cost of this transition is really not that bad. It's quite affordable. And what they were talking about was not that the people who were putting these estimates forward are overestimating the costs of these technologies, but simply that the total capital that will be required to bring this about is mostly going to be diverted from things that it would otherwise have been spent on. The capital investment in our country runs around 500 billion. I think it's actually closer to $600 billion per year right now. So we will, over the next 25 years, spend 12, 14, 15 trillion dollars in capital in this country on all sorts of things, a large portion of it on buildings, including on our existing buildings. And so the transition to carbon-free state is more about the redirection of capital investment than it is about suddenly having to find a way to come up with more capital investment than we have. Capital investment in Canada it's not going to go to 30% of GDP. It's going to stay down at its 22 or 23% level, whatever it is. But that's enough. We can work with that, and we can get this job done without necessarily having to increase our overall capital investment rate. At least that's my read of it. In fact, when you look at the spending in the electric utility sector in this country, the capital spending over the last number of years, it's been relatively low because the growth in electricity demand has been flat. And there's been a minimum amount of expansion, notwithstanding the various projects that have gone forward. capital spending in the electricity sector in this country has tended to be in the $20 billion a year range or a bit less. However, if you go back even further in time and look at what we were spending in the 1950s and 1960s, when we were building out the hydro dams, when we were building out the transmission and distribution system, when we were building those first big nuclear plants, as a percentage of business capital investment in this country, it was running around 16%. If we spent 16% of business investment in Canada today on the utility sector, it would take us up to 50 or $60 billion a year, way, way above what would be required for this transition. So I have a fairly a fairly optimistic attitude about the affordability of this, notwithstanding the eye-watering size of these aggregate numbers. We're a big, rich country, and we have significant capital resources to be directed at this challenge. And as Keane said, anything that you can actually do, you can afford. And I think we can actually do this. 3 quick things, and then I'll wrap. Vehicle to grid. I think this is huge. The talk that you hear these days about how expensive the renewable energy grid would be is largely because of the cost of the batteries. These utility batteries, even if the technologists are successful in bringing their costs down, they will more than double the cost of the transition to a wind and solar-based grid, as opposed to the cost of the actual solar panels and turbines themselves. And I'm thinking to myself, why don't we use the batteries in the electric vehicles? We will have 26 million personal electric vehicles in Canada by 2050 in this scenario. Most days they have way more capacity than they're going to use that day. And so I programmed into my scenario. Oh, did I go dark? Are you there?
No, you're good. Go ahead.
Can you still see my slide?
Yes. Yes, your slides are good.
Okay. My screen went, okay, fine. So what you see on the left-hand side is a 24-hour average day in July 2050 in Ontario. I can do these for any average day in any month in any province, but this example is taken from Ontario. And the green is the wind electricity, the yellow is the solar, and the black line, well, and then the red, how best to explain this? That's the supply of electricity. The black line that runs through that represents the demand for the consumption of electricity during the day, if you like, if you don't have vehicle to grid. So all of the red area on the left-hand chart underneath that black line, we can't meet it with the supply of renewable energy. You need to find a way to move electricity from that solar peak into that red area under the black curve. The way to do that, I think, is vehicle to grid. And what you see on the right-hand side is the same day, the same supply pattern, the same pre-electric vehicle, vehicle to grid demand line, which is a dotted line. But now the dark black line represents the consumption of electricity, the net consumption of electricity, if the electric vehicles are programmed to charge up when there's surplus electricity available, and to discharge when the vehicles have surplus electricity and the grid can use it. So you see this huge midday hump in the consumption of electricity because the cars are charging up. The sun is out. Later in the evening, that green area in between the dotted line and the solid black line is a period of time when those electric vehicles on a net basis now are actually discharging electricity to the grid to help with the evening peak. and to later in the night help with the charging of the trucks. I assume the trucks don't participate in this and that they charge overnight. So this, I think, has the potential to virtually eliminate and certainly to a large extent reduce the need for expensive utility batteries. And it's a game changer. It changes the cost of providing a renewable electricity supply to such an extent that the relative economics of deep retrofits, ground source heat pumps, nuclear power, all of the things that are vying at the margin to provide that capacity are comparing to the cost of doing it with a renewable grid that is utilizing utility batteries for the storage you need in order to grab the solar power when it's available and then use it later in the day when you need it. In this next, where did I have it? In this chart, it's the top two graphs show what happens if you provide the power with utility batteries, and the bottom is I'm trying to see, what are we looking at? July again? I can't read my own titles because yeah, this is July 2050. This is Alberta in this case, okay? So the top two charts represent a July day in Alberta in the year 2050 with utility batteries kicking in midday to pick up the solar electricity and then discharging it later in the evening as a way of utilizing that wind and solar that's available that isn't needed at the moment. The bottom two charts show the same thing. The left hand is January and the right hand is July. So the left is winter, the right is summer, the top is utility batteries, and the bottom is vehicle to grid option. And then I compared the overall costs of the decarbonization scenario using the battery approach versus the V2G approach. And you'll see the details when we distribute these slides a little more. But as far as I can tell, vehicle to grid, which Canada has got leading expertise on, and we're well positioned to establish ourselves as international leaders in this area. I think it's going to be the cotter pin that enables the transition to this renewable grid. The reference case that I described earlier that I said for the grid comes in around $800 billion. It goes up to 1.7 trillion if you use utility batteries. So it's I'm looking forward. I mean, I've been testing this out. I seem to be getting people nodding their head and agreeing. So I really don't understand why there isn't much more excitement and attention to making sure that our electric vehicle charging infrastructure is established now while we're building it out in a way that will support two-way transmission of electricity from the cars and to the cars. Because I think this is one of the major elements of the grid that is coming. It turns utility planning upside down because you're essentially talking about a load that follows supply, and supply was always supposed to follow demand. So it's a whole new world, I think, that's emerging with the integration of electricity using end uses with the supply system that will supplant the old hub and spoke model of grids where large central hydro dams and fossil and nuclear powered steam engines would push out electricity in a one-way flow into the branches of and spokes of the distribution system. That's going to give way to something much more efficient, much more distributed, much more interesting, and much more economically cost effective in the long run. And I think vehicle to grid epitomizes, along with microgrids in general, and the way that the grid is going to evolve in this future. I said the second thing I wanted to point out was this question of nuclear is interesting. Here in this chart, you can see three different variations I looked at. The large graph on the left is my reference scenario. And don't put too much stock in the absolute dollar numbers because I've done some revising since I made this chart, but you see my reference scenario for Ontario. This is for Ontario, future electricity supply coming in around $373 billion over the next 25 years, with wind being the heavy lifter and nuclear, all the existing committed rebuilds, plus the prototype at Darlington. I think by 2050, using reference case forecasting, the Darlington prototype is about all that's still running because the rebuilds would have run their course. And so this is my base on which I then build two other scenarios. The second one, which is variation A, which is represented in the top right, includes Bruce C. It includes all of the planned rebuilds, not just the ones that are committed. It includes all 4 of the 300 megawatt units that are still sort of a plan for the Darlington station, the so-called SMRs. And as I said, it includes Bruce C. This saves, you don't have to build as much wind. You don't have to build as much transmission and distribution. But in spite of that, the overall cost of variation A as compared with the reference is 385 billion instead of 372. So the cost of making that additional commitment to nuclear while achieving exactly the same results with respect to electricity supply and reliability and all of that looks to me to be, well, whatever the difference is, 385 to 373, so about $12 billion extra cost of increasing the nuclear supply like that. And then I looked at another scenario, which in addition to everything in variation A, includes this includes this idea of building the world's largest, what would be the world's largest nuclear power station at the Wesleyville site. And I'm assuming they talk it could be 8 to 10,000 megawatts. So I've assumed it would be an 8 times 1200 megawatt station. And I've added that, and I'm using the moderate capital cost estimates as published by by the National Renewable Energy Lab in the States. They have a fairly authoritative database on that. And now the capital cost jumps to $442 billion from variation A, which was 385. And I tried other nuclear variations, but every time you commit an additional dollar of capital expenditure to new nuclear builds, you drive up the cost of decarbonization. There's, I don't think, any escaping it unless somebody magically finds a way to bring these $10,000 to $15,000 per kilowatt numbers that people are now seriously talking about with regard to the total capex of new nuclear build. You've got to bring that down by a tremendous amount before it will not still be the case that if you want a emission-free grid in this country in 2050, including in Ontario, it's going to be about wind. And to the extent that you supplement that with nuclear, you're going to make the job more expensive than it would otherwise be. I know this is a controversial finding, and given my historical views about nuclear, it will be challenged. I hope it will be challenged. I would love to see somebody prove it wrong. But as far as I can tell, nuclear drives up the cost of getting out of the climate trap in a fairly dramatic way. And a $65 billion premium for Ontario to lean into nuclear while they try to decarbonize.
Ralph,
So
Ralph,
yes,
can I get you to pause? You've been feasting us on a big smorgasbord for an hour. Could you draw
yeah,
the presentation itself to a close and
yes,
then get into a conversation?
yes. I will just close with the third point, and I'll just go right to the bottom line that I took a look at how much how much less my scenario would cost if we had a coast-to-coast transmission trunk line in this country that every province could feed to and take from. And it takes about $100 billion off the scenario cost, and it has the added benefit of distributing the amount of wind that has to be built much more evenly across the country so that provinces like Winnipeg, like Manitoba and Quebec, which otherwise might not be as strongly motivated to build wind, would be because they would be able to put it on the national grid. So this national transmission trunk line idea is a win-win-win, at least $100 billion. So bottom line, I guess, John, is that There is a path forward. This is, I said at the outset, an emergency response plan. It's not attempting to be an optimization scenario, but I think that we could afford to make a transition in this country, which is technologically possible, which is fundamentally economically affordable, which would strengthen east-west ties in this country. It would strengthen provincial economies, but also the Canadian Federation. I think it provides a wonderful platform for implementing the new direction that the Canadian economic and industrial strategy is going to have to pursue in the face of the meltdown that's occurring south of the border. And I think that there's a tremendous synergy between the imperative of responding to climate change on an emergency basis and the imperative that we now face in this country of renewing our economy with a stronger interdependence across the country and less reliance on trade with the United States. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Sorry, let me.
John, you're muted.
Do that. Oh.
You're muted again. John, you're muted.
Looks like he's saying something quite interesting.
Yeah, indeed.
I can't hear you, John.
Okay, Ralph, this is Dave Doherty. I know that he was going to pass over to me the first question. So with your permission, I will ask it.
And following Dave, I'll be going to Ted Manning. So Ted, get ready, please. Over to you, Dave.
Okay, fine. I just want you to know, John, that we missed everything you were saying. I was trying to get you to get your mic working, but it didn't work. Anyway, so here's my question. Have you run various scenarios with lower and higher population and economic activity? If we are facing an emergency, I would argue we need a lower population and we need less economic activity, which would reduce our need for more of these kinds of resources.
No, I've not done that. I have only one population outlook, and it's 0.8% or 0.9% growth per year. And I don't really use the economic growth too much in my work, but it does come into play in the industrial sectors and to a certain extent in the commercial building sector. But most of the growth in electricity consumption in this scenario is a result of electrification, not of activity and population growth. That's what those earlier slides were portraying, where I showed the percent of the problem or challenge, if you want to put it that way, that stems from the existing building stock and so on versus growth. So I take your point, but I think you'll find that the conversion of fossil fuel to electricity is the big driver of electricity growth, not population increase.
That being said, I might recommend, if you have the time, that you try to run these scenarios, or at least once, with a stable population, and say once with a population that's gradually falling, not one where we are trying to reduce our population by, putting people in camps the way the Americans are almost certainly going to do, or deporting all kinds of people, which is ludicrous, but rather slow, calculated reduction in our population.
I did run that scenario several months ago. I should refresh it. I was curious to get an answer to the very question you're asking, and
right.
I came away with the conclusion that I just mentioned, which is electrification is really driving electricity consumption growth.
Right. Well, it would be good to show that.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Good point. I will.
Ted.
Yes, Ralph, very nice to hear from you again. Haven't heard from you for a bit. I'm going to actually exacerbate what David just said. I'm more worried about consumption than numbers. And we have been spending a lot of time trying to find ways to get people to consume less, whether it's energy or goods or you pick it. I'm not sure whether you've done any work on that, but we've been looking at, again, the sensitivity of demand to different kinds of consumption and asking the question, are there any feedbacks that would cause people actually to reduce their individual consumption or to collaborate with others to collectively try and reduce their impact on the planet?
Yeah, I did. There's a school that you may have heard of, a school of academic writing on this called the Sufficiency School.
Yep.
And we have a fellow at Dalhousie here in Canada, Anders Hayden, who has written a book called When Green Growth Is Not Enough, who is one of the leaders. And I would highly recommend, if you've never heard from him in your series, you might want to invite Anders to give a presentation. He and I, a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, did put together a proposal to try and quantify the impact that some of the Sufficiency School's top suggestions could make on greenhouse gas emissions, like the reduction in red meat consumption, I remember was one of them. And we couldn't get any funding to do it. But the arithmetic is pretty simple. The Kaya identity tells us that total greenhouse gas emissions are equal to the level of activity times the energy use per unit of activity times the emissions per unit of energy use. That's the bare skeletal bones of any modeling like this. And so if you can reduce that first term, you get an undamped response to in the emissions. I guess the only rider I would put, so I'm a fan. I think we need to address that. The only rider I would put on my response is that now we're in an emergency and we have to get off fossil fuels, and no amount of cutting back consumption that will make the job easier perhaps, but it's going to have to be a technological alternative to the burning of fossil fuels that actually gets the job done. Now that job will be easier at lower consumption levels, but it can't be done. You can't conserve your way off fossil fuels. This is the whole retrofit issue that's coming up. You know, you can convert a house to a heat pump and that house is now off fossil fuel, even if it's not an efficient.
If we put enough people all in one house and let them live off their own body heat, does that make a difference?
That would
what
probably
I'm saying
have
is lifestyle changes will be very hard to affect, but they just might be necessary.
Yeah, I just think, I mean, I published a couple of papers, one in the Journal of Energy Economics, I think it was, and another one in the Journal of Energy Efficiency, that did a fairly detailed breakdown of why the energy GDP ratio in Canada did not grow and actually declined significantly between, I think this was a few years ago now, but I chose the period from 1990 to 2005, I believe. And these things that you're talking about really come into sharp relief when you sit down to try and dissect why did we not see fuel and electricity consumption growing in this country at anything like one might have expected. And it was changes, not just necessarily, or maybe even not primarily reductions in consumption, but definitely changes in the structure of the economy. And I don't know if there's any clear-cut examples of consumption. The consumption, unfortunately, has tended to go in the other direction, whether it's bigger vehicles, the shift to SUVs, or the shift to more space per person in our housing sector.
Yeah.
There is a trend towards 75% of the building starts in this country last year were multifamily. That's the exact negative of what it was.
That actually will be in that model, a factor in causing social change, which may bring other things. Thank you very much, Ralph. I think you're really on top of this stuff and we need to listen.
Most days it feels like it's on top of me, but I appreciate it.
You too. Have a good one.
Thank you. Ralph, I have a comment. The UK in the late 1990s decided that it wanted to get totally off of coal combustion to make electricity, which was the major part of their electrical supply. I mean, they have no tall hills with lots of water flowing down them. So they made it a political decision in the late 20th century to go all in on wind. I think the contribution of wind in the late 1990s was 2% to the electricity generation in the UK. They now have 30% coming from wind, and they have got off coal for generating electricity. So there was a government, I should have stayed in UK maybe, that actually understood what happened with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and took action to do it. Now, more recently, the string of conservative prime ministers in Whitehall gave way to, after an election, yes, we have an election coming too, to a government which is recommitted to wind. What do you think will it take to get a Canadian government, federal perhaps to start with, to actually take serious steps to do what you show is possible?
Well, I think in general, what seems to be always present when you see a government start to take serious action, whether it's a local government or a national government, in my experience, has been two things. One, you just get strong leadership at the top. And, you're lucky if you get it. Most of the time you don't. But you get visionary leadership. And I think on the climate issue, Tony Blair probably had a bit of that going, for whatever else you might think about him. And that contributed to those early trends that you were describing. The tradition of science-informed public policy in Britain remains strong, and that definitely had a big influence. And then the other thing is opportunism. When political leadership sees that an issue can help advance other issues which are important, whether it's housing or employment or local economic development. And I've seen this time and again, especially at the local government level, where you will see mayors and councillors at the local authority level get very enthusiastic about climate mitigation strategies because they see them as a key to unlocking the co-benefits, if you like. The so-called co-benefits of doing these things address many issues which are valued more highly, both financially and politically, by their constituents than the reduction of GHG emissions. So that's why in my closing comments today, I tried to bring it back to what I think is a strong overlap between what we need to do to seriously address climate change and what we need to do to seriously renew the Canadian economy in the face of this changing world economic order that we're living through. I think that these can work together, and I'm hoping that's the way that we'll see climate change move up the agenda in Canada in the months ahead at the federal level.
Thank you. Claude, I invite you to, if you could, to make the next point or question. Thank you.
Well, that's actually a very good segue. And you can see by my name tag, I'm actually in Minnesota. So this might be a very naive US question, because we are doing so miserably here on stepping back, basically lobotomizing ourselves when it comes to understanding what's in front of us. And then, quite frankly, that's not an accident. It might actually be to control panic across the nation, which will only be worse. But that's an aside. I'm actually addressing, do you see any indications? You're saying what you see is hopeful in Canadian politics. But just for a point of comparison, you're asking for a 4% of Canadian GDP from now for the next 25 years to get to this transition. And by the way, that's a very reasonable number because I also put in the chat for future reference, both here and the YouTube audience, that 3 years ago, the McKinsey & Company, multinational consulting firm, put out a report that is still up. And they suggested it would take 8 to 9% of global GDP across the globe, beginning at 2022 all the way through 2050. That obviously is not happening. And so my first reaction is, well, it's a wonderful dream that 4% could consistently be put out for this transition, but politics gives us whiplash, and a lot of things that are great ideas can be just scrapped on a whim. And so I'm actually going to sort of ask you not to repeat yourself, but where are the indications that you see that are positive in Canada that this will actually happen?
Well, I mean, I guess the diversity of our federation helps in this regard. Is at any given time, there's usually one or two provinces that are on the upswing in terms of their response to climate change. One thinks of Quebec and British Columbia, for example, and to a certain extent, Nova Scotia. So we have the advantage in Canada of having provincial governments in some cases, which can go ahead and take leadership on this issue. And in many ways, because of their constitutional responsibilities, are better positioned to take leadership than the federal government. And then further down at the local government level, there are many, many local governments that are seriously addressing this issue, big and small. And I go way back on this issue. I got involved in the 1990s with local governments around the world that were taking responsibility for this issue in their communities. And St. Paul and Minneapolis were leaders at that time in that regard. And so I take hope from sort of that bottom up diversity of action on climate change, which persists even through the ups and downs of what's going on with national governments on these issues around the world. This is, I take hope from the fact that, I'm trained as a scientist. This issue is not going to go away because we don't like it. We've got to face it. And I think it's just going to become increasingly clear whether the Chinese have to show it to us or the Australians need to show us, but there's many, and the Germans, I mean, there's the Norwegians, there's more and more real examples emerging where countries are demonstrating, or regions of countries are demonstrating, that if you really lean into this transition, this energy sustainability transition, it ends up delivering all sorts of benefits economically, politically, sociologically to your country. So I just think it's going to be harder and harder to resist that. We can forget it. We can lose sight of this, I think, in North America, because we really are dragging. Both Canada and the United States are, well, if many of you, I'm sure, do travel, and you travel in Europe, and if your eyes are open, one of the things you'll notice just walking around is that, wow, they are really moving on the solutions that are needed to address the climate challenge, whether it's the solar panels or the wind turbines or the energy efficiency in their buildings. They're actually way ahead of us. And of course, then there's the Chinese example as well, which is mixed bag. I know. I mean, it's a incredibly mixed bag, but cat's out of the bag on this. So I think it's just going to build and build momentum, and the internal logic of making a transition to an energy and an economic system which works within the ecological boundaries of the place where we're located, within the global ecosystem, is just overwhelming. You can't resist it indefinitely. And we've really assaulted that global ecosphere in the last 200 years, and we're paying the price, and we'll continue to pay the price for having done that. But the other side of the lining in that cloud, I guess, is that it really is leading to a rethinking of what constitutes good engineering, what constitutes good architecture, what constitutes good community planning. And the answers to those questions that the young engineers and the young architects are pursuing are quite different from the answers that prevailed 25 or 40 years ago when our current infrastructure was being put in place. Conquering nature and built bigger is always better is no longer the prevailing paradigm, in my view. So I think that there's a generational shift going on, which is going to help build the momentum toward this change as well.
So Ralph, thank you for a very eloquent answer and hopeful.
Ralph, you referred just a moment ago to the work at the levels of communities, municipalities, to get all the wind turbines built that are required in your scenario will require at least a decision at the provincial level and preferably at the national level. Do you think there's much prospect of doing that? And Art, please put your video on and your microphone.
Okay. I'm gonna shorten my question down to a very short one, because we're running out of time here. But I was delighted to listen to your excitement when you talked about vehicle to grid batteries. Because as you know, I have been running a microgrid and experimenting quite a bit in terms of how I can improve efficiency, etc. Now, but I have a home battery, and I have 3 Tesla Powerwalls. I know these are really quite popular in the U.S. and they're growing. And if they could be used as in the same way as vehicle to grid, that would really enhance some of your projections. Did you in fact include the home batteries in your analysis with vehicle to grid?
I have not yet. However, mathematically, I don't think there's really much difference. What I think the V2G modeling that I did do illustrates is that there's an alternative to the big central 60, 70, 100 megawatt battery, whether it's the battery, the Tesla wall approach in the house, or whether it's the 100 watt battery under the hood of your car. It's the same alternate approach. What I love about the V2G approach is not that those batteries are cheap, it's that the car owners have already paid for them. And so you have the possibility, and the cars, as you know, are sitting idle 95% of the time. So it just, I'll tell you a funny short story. I was giving a talk in Muskoka a few months ago, and I was hosted by a couple who lived at the end of a line that had very poor reliability, electricity reliability, and they're customers of Hydro One. They had 2 Teslas. This was a fairly well-to-do couple, and beautiful home, but in the middle of nowhere on a lake at the end of the transmission or the distribution line. Hydro One had just installed 2 Tesla batteries at Hydro One's expense in their basement. Their only responsibility was to keep them clean and add them to their home insurance policy. And for Hydro One, it was cheaper than building redundancy into the local distribution system. Meanwhile, there's 2 Teslas in the garage. And I remember thinking, there's something wrong with this picture, But but yeah, there'll be no stopping people that want to build that people like yourself who want to have that reliability and security built right into their own home. But it's pretty hard to compete with the magnitude of the storage that's going to be available in the electric vehicle fleet, which is, I think, available to the utilities for the cost of connecting to it and offering the car owners something for their trouble.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Very, very good answer. I loved it.
Thank you indeed. Ted Manning, can I call on you, please?
Yes, you can. This was another very interesting talk in our whole series of trying to change the planet. Everybody has information that the rest don't, and I think we always come out of this knowing more than we did when we went in. So I would like to particularly thank Ralph. Ralph, I don't think this is the first time you've talked to us, is it? I think it's at least the
No,
second.
yeah, I think it's the fourth.
Fourth, yeah, I knew it was. And every time you bring something worthwhile, and we are enjoying hearing you. So I'll extend the invitation yet again for a fifth time but in a few months or a year or two, and we can hopefully get progress report on how well this is actually working. Meanwhile, we apparently are heavily dependent on politicians for keeping the wind going. So I'm assuming that we have a number of different energy sources that we can draw on, and let's just find out which ones people are brave enough to actually try. So thank you again. Thank you for joining on our conversations. And I would ask anyone who has not paid their dues yet, please do. Just go on our website and hit the right place. And for those of you who are going to share this talk, please just make sure to ask people to subscribe to it and share it, because this makes it easier for us to get publicity for these very interesting presentations. So once again, thank you very much. We will do this again in a week, and please tell your friends. That said, we can turn our video and audio on, and we will stop